Hi, welcome to today's video. My name's Paul. So today is just doing some watercolor painting, some landscape painting. This time it's using a sort of wet in wet technique. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. Okay, so today I'm going to be doing some watercolor landscape painting. And this is more a wet in wet technique. So you saw at the beginning there I was spraying water onto the paper, so the camera doesn't pick it up, but the top half of the paper is now soaked with water, and now I'm putting on more water with a bit of pigment, blue pigment. So a few videos ago I put up a very short watercolor tutorial which talked about the differences between wet in wet and dry in wet and so on. So I'll link that video in the description below. If you just go down below the video, there's the description box. You click on show more and you'll find there's some links in there. So you can see the top half of the paper is soaked. You can see the water starting to run down. Wet in wet techniques are, if you are a control freak, if you really want to be in control of absolutely everything, wet in wet watercolor techniques are probably not going to work for you, or you'll find them very frustrating because you're not really in control, or you're never in 100% control. It's a bit like driving a car on an icy morning. You know that when you put your foot on the brake, it might stop, or maybe it won't stop, or it'll take a bit longer to stop than you thought. But the good thing about the wet and wet techniques is you can create watercolor effects that you can't create with any other medium, really. So this is a very small landscape. You can see it's a small piece of paper. The paint I'm using is Sennelier paint. It's a French company. They're, I suppose, most famous for their watercolor paint and soft pastels. They also make, I suppose, oil pastels. I think they were the first company to make oil pastels. And then the paper itself, the paper is, so you know that with watercolor paper you can have hot pressed and cold pressed. The hot pressed is also called smooth, and the cold pressed is called rough. And then in between you sometimes get paper called nut. So it's not rough, it's not smooth, it's something in between. And that's what this paper is. It's not completely smooth, but it's not that rough either. By rough I mean there's not a lot of texture on the surface of the paper. The paper is made by a German company. I can't remember the name exactly. It begins with an H, and I couldn't pronounce the name even if I can remember. Okay, so in order to create the impression of reeds and grasses and things, you can see I scratched the surface of the paper a bit. Also, in this case, although the top half of the painting was very sort of wet in wet, this bottom half, the paper, isn't as wet. I dried it off with a paper towel. So when I put the paint onto the paper, it's sort of more staying where I put it, and you get slightly harder edges. Another thing worth pointing out, the yellow paint that I put on there, if you put the yellow paint on top of the green paint, they're going to mix because that part of the paper is very wet. And when they start to mix, you're not going to get as bright colors. get more muted colors and things start to look a little bit muddy perhaps. So don't cover the entire paper with one color. Leave white patches so that you can put other colors in there and create more interesting effects. With watercolor, people sometimes use the end of the brush or their nail to move paint around or scratch the surface. Some people throw salt onto the watercolor to create different effects. As the salt dissolves, it sort of pushes the pigment and the water away, so you get these sort of bloom effects. I've seen people using washing up liquid or soap or some sort of soapy liquid for also creating different effects. I think with watercolor, don't be afraid to experiment. You can't, if you have oil paint or acrylic paint, you can always create texture on the surface by using sort of impasto techniques, building up the paint, or using a palette knife to scrape away parts of the paint and things like that. With watercolor, of course, you can't really do that because watercolor just sort of sinks into the paper and you can't use impasto techniques. But you can do other things like scratching the surface of the paper, using salt, using soap, things like that. The other thing to point out here is very often you'll hear people saying watercolor is done in layers and you let the first layer dry before you put the next layer on. You can see I didn't do that here. It was all painted in one sitting. And with wet and wet techniques, that's usually the case. You don't let things dry, you keep everything wet and just keep adding more paint. The end result is you're not going to get as many details because the wet and wet doesn't really let you create details. The paper has to be dry to get those hard edges, which allows you to create small details. Okay, so that's the end of today's video. I hope maybe it's of use to someone. If you'd like to subscribe, just click on the big red button below and the bell icon beside that. If you click on that as well, it lets you know when I've uploaded a new video.